Welcome to the first episode of the Heritage Hub podcast produced by the Marion County Public Library. Today's episode is on Newmarket, and here's your host, James Spraggins.
Today's show, I'm very excited about. We're going to talk about a community called Newmarket. Our guest today is Richard Crum. Richard Crum and his wife Mimi, they live in Newmarket. He knows a great deal about today's subject. I'm very happy that he has agreed to come on. He's done a lot of research, and he's been able to dig up some fabulous photographs that we'll be able to present to you in some way. I'd like to welcome Richard to the podcast. Like I said, you've come upon a lot. You've taught me a lot of things. Like I did not know about the Carter family that was a prominent family there, and you showed me a photograph of their. You would almost call it a mansion, this historic home that used to be there that they operated as a tavern. Give me a little bit about some broad strokes about the history of Newmarket, if you would.
As you know, it started, Newmarket, actually one of the first figures in Newmarket to try to sell it as a place, importance. He recognized what you just said. The setting was just perfect, and was a guy named William Muldrow. And he spelled, in some of the readings I've seen with him, now it's spelled in the old days it was spelled Muldrow. At one point I had seen that. And in 1794 or thereabouts, he got this idea of drawing up a city plan for a place he would call New Lystra. And I started looking up the definition of Lystra, and has a lot of, I don't know how to describe it, a lot of positive, promising, shining city on the hill type connotations. There was a city in ancient Greece, or Macedonia one, that's named Lystra, and he wanted to sell this as a great place to build a city. And in those days, it looked really good. He, in 1794, he started developed a pamphlet, I guess you would call it today, where he had the streets drawn out, and he had descriptions and with the river and the land and the layout. And he had these on the market in Philadelphia for investors. And there were some, I've read in other places that it went as far as London, England. I don't know if some of the stuff was there or not. It may have been. But at that time, Kentucky's on the outskirts of what's going on, and people, it just didn't go over. People weren't interested, and so that particular attempt just faded away. As far as Lebanon and Newmarket competing, I always heard that little story about Newmarket being the perfect county seat. Of course, it's not in the center of the county, whereas Lebanon is just about, close to the geographic center. And I don't know. I was always told that the railroad was the deciding factor. 1857, the railhead, came to Lebanon from Louisville. So there were just more. Plus, I don't know about the comparative populations either. I suspect there were more people in Lebanon than there was in Newmarket, which, and it probably.
Could I stop you real quick? As I understand it, I go to the Presbyterian church here in town, and Lebanon as a community was established by a group of Virginia Presbyterians, McElroys. Also, I think one of those families was Handley, and I believe Handley moved to Newmarket, what's now Newmarket. He was one of the first settlers there, if I understand it correctly. Now, they built their first church in Lebanon, and I'm not exactly sure why they chose Lebanon. You would almost, if you just look at it geographically, Newmarket is on the Rolling Fork River, and Lebanon was on Jordan Creek. So, and also Hardin Creek.
Right.
But if you were going to establish a community that intended to connect to the larger world, looks like you'd go to the Rolling Fork.
Right. In those days, the Rolling Fork was navigable almost year-round. Today, you have like the highs and lows because of all the forest has been removed. And so back in the old days, the forest litter and stuff would hold enough water and filter it, incidentally. And the river level stayed, unless there was just a gargantuan amount of rain, it stayed about the same. And there was a guy named Martin Everhart who in 1799 was running a boathouse in Newmarket, just across from where Ward's Branch Road is, down off the hill there by the river. And they would run flatboats out of Newmarket, and Raywick also did this a lot, all the way to New Orleans. And then they would sell.
Are you talking about the area? Are you talking about the area just below the current mill dam?
Yeah, it's probably half a mile below it. Yeah, somewhere in that area, maybe less, maybe an eighth of a mile below it. But somewhere in that area, there was. I don't think there's anything left. I never heard of anybody finding any trace of the deal, but I've read about it a couple of times, and I think it went on for maybe, I don't know, a decade or so, and then it sort of faded away. But these guys would go to New Orleans, sell their stuff, I guess whiskey, tobacco, and some other stuff, and then sell the lumber from the boat too, and then walk back. And they walk back what's
Right.
called now, or usually the Natchez Trace, and that was a good place to get
Right.
held up, if you might know, because it was well known that you had a little money, and so you had to have your ears open and your head on a swivel. So that was one
That's
interesting
right.
thing. There was also an ice house on the river below the bridge on the Jessietown side. If you go under the bridge going towards St. Joe, I think Bobby Buckman, who died here recently, was telling me about. They discovered an ice house on the far side of the bank, and when it would have straw, they discovered some poplar planks and things, and they identified it as an old ice house, for storing ice during the winter when the river was frozen. Now, you were asking about the lagoons down between St. Joe and Jessietown. They're the remnants of a Pleistocene lake that existed here. I'm not sure of the beginning and end. I know the Pleistocene era is anywhere from 2 million down to about 10,000 years ago. And the lagoons are it's where you can find the last sediment from this lake, which ran certainly from Bradfordsville and inundated all of what's now Newmarket to St. Joe and maybe beyond. I'm not sure if the Horseshoe Bend. See, there's a Narrows just below St. Joe. I don't know if the lake, I've heard that it went all the way to Howardstown, but I don't know that either. But it was there, and there used to be a Dever family in town that one of the boys was a geologist, and I got him to walk around with me, and he could identify by the type of soil and stuff some of the shorelines of this lake, up on a knob, or not up on it, but just short of the knob. So that lake has always fascinated me. And if you drive Stewart's Creek Road and you look off when you get about, I don't know, a half a mile from the end of Stewart's Creek going towards Campbellsville, you can see all of this bottomland and these points, that go out into what was then the lake. We used to find really old Indian points on some of these little protrusions out into what was then the lake. And they were old, like archaic, and maybe even some paleo stuff. So it would be neat to be able to time travel back and see what that looked like. But anyway, I was always fascinated by that. That was something I'm glad I found a picture. Some guy in 1953 did a geologic survey of it, and there actually was a lake. I never was completely sure that there was.
So this Pleistocene lake went from around Bradfordsville, you're saying all the way to Howardstown?
Well, I've heard it's all the way, but on this map it stops at just below St. Joe. And I think the reason it stops, but I'm not sure, is that's not the end of Marion County. It makes me think it actually stopped there. So this was a titled Pleistocene Lake in Marion County. So I didn't know if they stopped there, or because you could go further and down towards Raywick and still. But I've heard both ways. But that map shows it to just below St. Joe, and it was pretty wide.
It kind of makes sense when you drive to Howardstown. It looks like you have all that flat area. In fact, like they call it, there's some parts that are called the flats, around Stiles and Howardstown. It looks very similar to the area we're talking about.
Right, and the drainage pattern of the Ohio Valley is a little different. because of ice ages during that time, advances and retreats. You have a totally different drainage of meltwater and stuff. And so that probably is the reason that you had a lake there to start with. I don't know. Anyhow, but that's a kind of
Right.
an interesting little sidelight that's way back in time. Um, Newmarket was incorporated in 1817. It's the first, according to one source, it's the first incorporated village in Marion County. And it got I've seen two dates for the post office. Got one I think is correct. They established a post office in 1820, which lasted until about 1906. And the Carters ran the post office in a store that was associated with it, which is kind of like Blandford store at at Raywick. It's got a post office hooked
Yeah.
up to the store. And yeah, it was kind of a way to get, it's where people, it attracted business to the store, a little bit. And they sort of went together. Now, I couldn't find the old mill dam. It's got to be in the early 1800s as a wooden dam. I go back through the Collinses. They got it in 1879, and they kept it until 1923. And then another Ray Bradbury, or I've forgotten his last name, bought it from them in 1924. But before that time, if you look on the map, the 1877 map that shows Washington and Marion County, it's the Library of Congress. You can find that map, and it will enlarge and still be, legible. There's on the Old Mill Dam is labeled there, and there's two names associated with it. There's Chandler and Fawcett. Now, I don't know who they were, but they preceded Collins. That's who Collins got it from. Now, I don't know. They're the ones that are if they're connected with the guys who first started it, nor do I know exactly when it first started, but it's probably in the early 1800s they dug that sluice, and it was an undershoot mill, which is you had to have that. It didn't have that was just because of the lay of the land and stuff. And the foundations and stuff are still there.
Well, that's what I've heard. When the water's low, I've heard you can see it. What kind of a mill was it? Would you bring your grain?
Oh yeah, well mainly corn. That was probably any kind of a grain. Of course, you have to change what they call the burrs in the mill to suit the diameter of the grain, but that's easy to do. They're just two stones, turned together. There was, I'd say, lots and lots of people would grind corn to make cornbread. Cornmeal and flour, which was a little harder to come by. That'd be wheat and stuff. The mill would, in my understanding, could grind any of them just by adjusting. My dad used to, when he was a kid up in Eastern Kentucky, they ran a little mill, and he said that you only had to adjust. You could adjust to this diameter of the grain in order to grind it right, and so on. Now, there's a place, in fact, he lives up a road that used to be known as Joe Ray Hollow. And there's an old road that goes from, it's where the Coon Hunters Lodge is, across the road from it. If you go back in that little subdivision and go far enough back, you can find an old road that goes all the way to Phillipsburg. And people would bring their stuff from Phillipsburg, and I don't know, 7 or 8 mile radius to get it, ground. So that was a big deal in those days, is to get your grain ground so you can have, cornbread, and you raise hogs or whatever else you can, have. So I'd say the mill was a really, cutting edge business back in the day.
Which I would think would have also been a reason that Newmarket had a leg up on Lebanon, because I mean, like I said, Lebanon only had the Hardins Creek.
Yeah, Cartwright, of course, it's above it and it just starts. It's not very big, but on paper and from a geologic and geographic viewpoint, Newmarket looks a lot better. And I'm not sure until technology caught up with it. You had the train, and then it looks really bad. So I don't know all the ins and outs or how intense the competition was. I've always heard there was, that ended Newmarket's hopes of being, something more than just a little village. Like you say, the Lebanon Turnpike you see the name Newmarket splashed all over historical accounts in Marion County because of the roads it went through.
Sure.
And there was a road off of Boulders Hill, which comes out if you go to Jessietown, take a right, and there's a big curve going left. There's a house there was being torn down. With the driveway of that house is where that road went through there, and it comes out. It's nothing like the present, Turkey Foot. This was a straight road up a very long holler that came out at the top of Finley Ridge. If you turn right on Finley Ridge, you'll go back about a mile, and then you'll have a sharp turn to the left. And that's where that road came. I've walked that road. In 1838, they decided they would make a bridge across the river, and at the same time, they extended that road from Newmarket to Lebanon, and then on further in 1850 to Springfield. The way I've got it, I may have the dates a little bit wrong, but there was a Wathen also involved in that. He was one of the general contractors on that. And I think he went over budget and may have gone, I don't know if he went bankrupt or not, but I do know that people that lived on each side of the road were charged with the upkeep of the road to a certain degree. Like if it went in front of my front field, I had to help out. So the road is, you see it all the time. That bridge was built in 1838 and then it burned up in 1922. Somebody got their car on the bridge and stalled out and it caught on fire.
You're talking about the covered
Yeah,
bridge.
the old covered bridge, right, yeah. Somebody's car stalled in the bridge and evidently fired the bridge up and it burned up. Now, during the Civil War, in some of Morgan's, he has 2 or 3 forays up in Kentucky where he comes through Newmarket. But one of them, the Union took the planks up. They took the planks on the bottom of the bridge, the wooden planks, and so you couldn't roll across. Morgan, he won the skirmish, and incidentally, you can find lead washing out of banks and grave shot and all kinds of stuff down in that area. I have found lead all the way up in the knobs, like behind where we live. They would shoot and then miss everything, and the bullet would go up and hit the knobs, and then it would wash down to a fence line. And of course, lead turns out and it oxidizes to a white color. And I was sitting by a fence line. I was, what in the world? So one of those 58 caliber balls somebody fired off, probably a Confederate guy shooting towards the Union on this. So there were several skirmishes. Another thing connected with the Civil War, there's this super interesting character named Dennis Halsey. He was, I'm pretty sure, born in France. And he moved to Florida with his family when he was just a little kid. He was educated in St. Augustine, Florida. By 1850, at 20 years old, he was up in Hayesville in Marion County teaching school for some reason. I don't know how that all happened. And there was a doctor in the Hayesville Hotel. This doctor sort of took Halsey under his wing. Halsey got interested in medicine, went to U of L Medical School, went to Philadelphia College of Medicine, became a doctor, came back to Marion County, to Manton, and in 1857, 58, and was a doctor there 2 or 3 years, but he was like a ferocious unionist. And he, when the war started, got involved in a big way, set up a company, and in 1862, the Morgan was retreating from Springfield through St. Mary's and on through Jessietown up over Mulder's Hill. Halsey rode down through Newmarket, I guess trying to see, I don't know what his exact purpose. He was a colonel, incidentally. He encountered some Confederates and they got in a little skirmish and he got shot right in the face. And in fact, in the right square, I don't know why they did this. They went 1 inch above the eye and half an inch, and, killed him, of course. They brought his body up to Lebanon, and I'm sure, embalmed and so on. And he lay and stayed in Lebanon for 3 or 4 days. And Miss Foster, Foster Ray was a big prominent guy in town at that time. They had a wreath on his head and all kinds of poetry and so on. And as they say it. And then he was carried to St. Rose Cemetery. You can find his grave in
Oh,
St. Rose Cemetery in the Hamilton plot. And it's Dr. Dennis Hallisey,
I've never heard that name. Could you spell the last name?
Halisey. Dennis Hallisey.
Let me ask you one more question about the turnpike that just occurred to me. Now, these turnpikes, they didn't do it just out of the goodness of their hearts. They did it because it was a money making venture.
Oh, yeah,
And so they all like the turnpike. When you think of a turnpike, it's like a turnstile. And
that's right.
so these toll houses, that's where they would collect money, or you turned around and went home.
Yeah, yeah.
So, do you know? And I've heard that out here, not too far out, Springfield Road. There used to be a home that's been torn down. That at one time was a log structure that used to be a toll house. Was there one in Newmarket also?
I'm not sure. I do. Here's the ones I do know. There was, of course, one down where the Pizza Hut used to be down at the west end of town, where the Mexican restaurant is. There used to be a house there before your time. When I was a little kid, there was a guy named Cy Williams who was a
I know exactly what you're talking about. I knew
yeah,
Cy Williams, and I
yeah,
remember when they tore the house down. Dad,
oh yeah,
my father took me there. We went
yeah.
through it, and I heard that was a toll house. You're right. I
That
forgot.
wasn't Toll House. It was right on the road, as you notice. And there's another
Yeah.
one at McElroy Pike. There's a toll house. But I tell you where you can find out where every toll house in the county was. You get on the government, the Library of Commerce, loc.gov, and you get that map, 1877 map of Marion and Washington, and it's got every one of those toll houses identified. You can blow it up and move it around on the screen, and you can see exactly where
Wow.
every toll house was. But you're right; they
So we've already named three or more toll houses. They really hit you up, boy. If you had to go from Newmarket all the way to
yeah,
Springfield, you got hit up 3 times.
yeah, you get
They knew
hit.
what they were
Yeah,
doing.
yeah, they had an idea in mind there.
Is it your understanding that the Presbyterian Church was the first church in Newmarket?
I don't know if it was. I'm not sure. Here's what I know about those two churches. There was a Baptist church at the lower end of town. All right,
Okay.
down where the second cemetery is. There's two cemeteries in
Yeah.
Newmarket, and the lower
Right.
cemetery, they're both on the right side of the road if you're going south. In the lower cemetery, there was a Baptist church there that got destroyed along with the Presbyterian church in the 1870 tornado that came through Newmarket and just ripped it to shreds.
Wow.
Um, I do know that the Presbyterian church was around 1840. I've read that, and I don't know about the Baptist church. Now that Baptist church didn't. In fact, when the tornado came through, the Baptist church had some material sitting beside it to put a new roof on, and it just blew everything all over the place. And so by 1874, that church relocated to where Mulder's Hill Baptist Church is right now. A man named Sapp, I can't remember his first name, donated the land. And so Mulder's Hill sort of came out of that lower Baptist church. And then the Presbyterian church
Yeah.
got blown away in 1870, and they didn't rebuild until 1902. It laid no church there. In 1902, they rebuilt that church. And it lasted, I don't know, they got so small, I believe it was in the 30s, that they were absorbed by the Presbyterian church in Lebanon. And the building stayed there when I was a little kid. The building stayed there until the early 50s, and they tore it down. Because I remember seeing it when I was just a little kid. We moved there in 1950. When my dad moved to Newmarket, and my dad and mom did, there was there were two stores. There was a Miss Beeler had a store right at the end of our road, just before you
Wow.
get to that first cemetery. And there was a guy named Dan Collier who used to work at the Ford Garage, owned part of it, who made it into a dish barn in the 1960s. And then there was another store down where the old post office used to be, where Mike Ferris, who's now passed away, his lane, right where his lane comes out. And also Les Richardson's place, there was another store there, and there was a character who lived at the end of that lane in the 1900s named Rob Benningfield. And Rob, oh, listen,
Okay.
it's just a crime. There wasn't some kind of video recording, audio recording deal. He was one of the funniest guys in the universe. Rob Benningfield weighed about 275 pounds and was just a character. If you, there's nothing. He was a painter. Well, when he started out his younger life, he cut railroad ties. And a railroad tie, green, weighs about 260 pounds. And Rob was a big guy. He carried ties out on his shoulder. And he, in his later days, was a painter, and he didn't drive. So he would get out on the road, and everybody knew him, and take it just like catching the bus. He'd go to town, paint till 2 o'clock, and then go home so he could make all of the stores in the area and listen to everything and tell big lies and stuff like that. But now some of the older guys will still remember him. He was a piece of work, without a doubt. Quantrell's Raiders also came through a couple of times. The last time they came through was they came through February the 8th.
Explain who Quantrill was. He was like a guerrilla raider, right?
Oh, Lord have mercy. There, in those days, in the latter part of the war, there were a lot of these bands that, under the auspices of being a Confederate or a Union, would go around raiding places. And basically, they were murderers and thieves. Not all of them, but
Right.
by the most of them were not, patriots, as you would say. And Quantrill was one of the worst. He started out in Missouri. He had Frank James was in his bunch for a while, and he encountered a Union group that of soldiers by surprise, and wiped them out and took their uniforms. And so now he could go freely almost anywhere he wanted to, at least in certain areas, he and his guys dressed as Union soldiers. And they could get the one up on you that way. So anyway, there was a supply train of some type of Union supply train coming through New Market from the south on February the 8th in 1865. And Quantrell's Raiders intercepted them there and killed 4 of the guys. And they kidnapped 4 of the, I guess, officers, took them to Braversville and shot them up there. So he was just absolutely brutal. He was caught later. He died in prison in Louisville. Quantrill did. He's got if you ever look him up on Google or wherever, he's got an interesting early life before he became a raider. They're mostly opportunists, those raiding gangs. There was a Sue Mundy also that I think was a man under.
Right.
Yeah, so all of that, but that happened in New Market just before the end of the war, and the two, let's see, the 1870 tornado was written up into what's called I think it was the Lebanon Clarion. It was a paper in the 1870s that only existed for, I don't know, a few years. And if I'm not mistaken, the Enterprise may have kicked in right after that. But the Lebanon Clarion had a whole 2-page article, if you can find it, on this tornado. It gives you every little particular, because they send somebody out to interview everybody and so on. New Market, incidentally, also had a Dr. Lipscomb. And I don't know anything about him, but he shows up on the map, the 1877 map. So they had a wagon shop, they had a post office store, blacksmith place, a medical doctor, 2 churches. They're pretty accomplished little. Of course, in those days, you didn't go to town every day. You went to town maybe once every 6 months. So you had to be kind of self-contained.
Yeah.
And but that's a real interesting thing to read about, and you can find it people that are better on the computer than I am can find that article in the Lebanon Clarion. It's really, really interesting because it tells you a lot about who lived there.
One thing that's interesting when you told me about that 1870 tornado the other day, I have always heard that Lebanon has never had a tornado hit it directly, and I've always heard that it was because of that Muldra Hill escarpment always kind of shielded it. But I guess by being in all that flat area of the lagoons, Newmarket wasn't protected in that same way.
Yeah, well, these tornadoes can pick up and drop down. I always thought living beside right underneath a knob was a protection, and I guess it is a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
you'd be amazed how the tornadoes usually run from southwest to northeast. So it depends on what side of the hill you're on, and
Sure, right.
yeah. And so anyway, they had a bad one. We had one in, I don't know, about 30 years ago that just nicked Newmarket, got a few barns down on the Jessietown side of it. Now something else I wanted to tell you was in the graveyard. This is kind of a sad story. There was
Which graveyard?
the first graveyard, the Presbyterian. There's a grave in the back of this
Gotcha.
graveyard with just a simple gravestone, and it survived pretty much intact. And it's got Florence Newcomb, Newcomb, born 1875, died 1881. Now Florence's story, her dad was from Newmarket, and he moved to Texas, a place called Grayson, Texas, which is almost up in the Panhandle. All right, Florence was born in Texas, and she had a little sister born about 3 years younger than she was. Well, this Newcomb fellow, I can't remember his first name, his wife died. And so he decided that he would be better off moving back to Newmarket. So in 1881, they got on a train and they transferred, I guess, in St. Louis, the way the story goes. And somewhere between Grayson and Lebanon, the two little girls got smallpox, and so did the guy. And Florence died about 2 weeks after she arrived in Newmarket. And her little sister died about, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks after that. The dad survived the deal, and that's written up also in the Lebanon Clarion. They quarantined the family, of course, because they knew it was, contagious. And that story to me is always real sentimental because if you're in schools a lot, you see little second and third graders, and you wonder, well, how scary. Here's this little kid whose mom died. She gets on a train with her dad, goes to a new place. She gets sick and she dies. And she not only dies, but dies in quarantine. Pretty rough, deal. And so what we do every now and then, about every year, we take a bunch of flowers and put it down there on her headstone. It's just a sad story. You sort of feel connected. You think it's making her feel better or something. But anyway, she's a sort of an unusual story about the upper cemetery. The lower cemetery has the older graves in it. Some of those are in the 1700s, born, and there's a few in the upper one too. They have some of the names, your instance. One of the big families in Newmarket that you don't see anywhere around here is Mussens, Mussen. If you look at that 1877 map, they're just full of Mussens. One of the Mussens, named William, was a lieutenant in the Union Army. Another name is Moppin, but it's spelled Moppen instead of the way they spell it now. For some reason, I guess, and I'm assuming it's the same bunch in general. There were Spiveys, Carters were real big. There were a couple of Hickey families, believe it or not, that lived near Newmarket. And there's Taylors. There's a house on my place, used to be on my place, of a man named John Taylor. I had my strawberry patch down there in his backyard. There's the only thing left now is a well. And I come up with all kinds. I came up with clay pipes. That was a common deal in those. Well, for a couple of centuries, you had like cheap clay pipes. I came up with a couple of those, all kinds of things. 1886 silver dollar. Somebody lost it. I'll bet you they were, that's a lot of money in those days.
Right. Oh yes.
His
Yeah.
house was a house. Yeah, it was built around a log cabin. There's several houses around that are built around old log cabins. But anyway, some other names are Sapp, Miller, Taylor, Parsons, Lake, Newcomb, and Carter's. Those are some of the big ones around Newmarket. Newmarket School was, I don't know when it was started. I'd say after 1900, somewhere in the early 1900s, but it closed in 1948. And you have a couple of pictures there. So it had a school. There was a school in Jessietown. The one in Newmarket was, like most of them, K through 8. But Newmarket in general is, I've been trying to get David Doherty to put a big sign, and he put a little sign up for Newmarket. If you drive out there, just past.
I noticed that.
Yeah, but I'm trying to get him. I kind of lay off during the COVID deal to put up a real big sign with Newmarket on it, and because when you see like weather maps on Channel 3, Channel 11, they'll have Newmarket on there, and so there's a lot of every other little town around has got St. Joe, Raywick, just that and the other, except for Newmarket,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a pretty, in the early history of the county, it's a pretty significant little place. Carter's owned a fairly large farm that the Buckmans now own, and they had a family cemetery that's back at the edge of one of those knobs. I haven't got it totally located, but I found somebody who was doing something in 1976 that roughly gave me an example of where it's at. And some boys went up and I think destroyed all the headstone kids, doing stuff except for one. So you won't find a Carter. I don't think there's a Carter buried in either of those two cemeteries. And they had their own, and so there's actually 3 cemeteries in Newmarket. One's a family, and they were quite big, a lot of Carters. And I don't know when that big house was built either. I need to find that out. I couldn't discover that anywhere.
Could I ask you about I don't know anything about it. I've barely
Sure.
planted a garden in my yard, so
Yeah,
I don't
right,
know a
right.
lot about farming, but
Yeah.
it looks like excellent farming land. Am I right about
Oh,
that?
it is. Oh, it is. It gets better as you get away from the knobs and towards the river, of course,
Okay.
because the river, of course, deposits sediment, and over several centuries, thousands of years, that's why your bottomland's got like 10-foot deep soil, is all the river,
Right.
flooding and packing it up. The
Right.
whole area through there, just like all of Marion County, has lots and lots and lots of Indian occupation. There's, like I said, you find stuff from 10,000 years ago some places. If you go to Campbellsville and you see grain bins on your left on the big road, and just after you cross the river, you see some grain bins on your left. The field on the right, back towards the river, is, if you look at it on Google Earth, when there's no crops on that field, you see all these little black areas where charcoal was. You see the outlines, and it is, that's one of the ways the state, when they build roads, if they want to check to see if there's an archaeological possibility that they don't want to just rip up, they'll look at aerial photographs, and outlines of things will show up that you can't see from up close at all. You can see, that area was used as a seasonal, according to, when I used to work in Louisville, I went over and had me grid that field off, or look for stuff, and I would mark down exactly where I found it, take it to U of L. I got friendly with them. I'd give them all the artifacts and where they were found, and then I found one day I was looking at a cornfield, and I found 3 teeth, and I went, whoops, those aren't deer teeth. And I found a little odd bone, and I thought it looked kind of like a smashed vertebrae. Turns out I took these to Louisville, and they carbon dated it for me because I'd been, helping them. And turns out it was some individual who carbon dated at about 2,100 years ago, give or take 300 years one way or the other, air factor. So this place, you can just find Indian stuff all over the place. It's amazing,
I'll be
you
darned.
know, a pretty rich area.
It's my understanding that, right. It's my understanding, though, that there weren't year round Native American settlers
You're right.
here. They
Yeah.
came through. They came through, but they would stop at the same places.
Yes. Yeah.
Year to year to year, they would
Yeah.
stop at
Yeah.
the same places, and so you'd have an accumulation
Right.
of artifacts.
That's right. Now that's true. The Kentucky used as a sort of a temporary. That's true back for about 1,000 years. Before that, it's a totally different story. You have like the woodland culture, the Adena culture from up in Ohio, lots of cultures that, in fact, down below Raywick towards Howardstown, there's several mounds down there that are have all kind. Or they're not. They don't exist anymore. They've been excavated. I don't know about. But anyway, there's Proctor Knott. His history talks about it. So what you just
Mm-hmm.
said is basically true during the historic period, maybe for 1,000 or a couple thousand years back. Before that time, most of the Indians in the area were on the move anyway, and they did just what you said. They were more hunting and gathering and less fixed agriculture, and so they would make the rounds,
Right.
and they would have a winter camp somewhere down maybe in the around Louisville or where there's some shelter and overhangs and stuff like that. So yeah, you're right about it's amazing how
Mm-hmm.
much stuff you can find. I mean, you go through a plowed field and you'll see stuff all over.
We are coming up upon an hour, and it has flown by for me. But I don't. But I would like to give you the opportunity if there are some high points you wanted to hit that we haven't gotten to yet. But I also have a couple of general questions. What was it like? So you've lived there since 1950. I'd like you to talk a little bit about
Right.
what's it been like to live there. What was it like in the early years when you were there, and also I want you to talk a little bit about the Woodland Inn, which we have not mentioned.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. My mother used to go there to dance.
Yeah, I've always heard they had
Uh,
live music. A good friend of mine, Andrew, told me that he used to go there, and they had a great little
yeah.
jazz group that
Oh
came
yeah.
in, would play there, and he come there.
As a kid, we used to love to go. My dad, who was Clark Crumb, was a master. I don't know how to put it. He could get. Um, he enjoyed getting other guys worked up, playing with them, and
Mm-hmm.
just messing around with them. So I would go to the stores with him, and of course Rob would be there and a few others, and they would have. I mean, it was like way better than late. Oh, it was just you know every night you'd go to one of the stores, and then as I got a little older, the store traffic changed over to Jessytown, and there's a million stores.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we got to get on there. I probably got 50 stories about things that happened, this and that. Entertaining little deals about how this guy set that one
Yeah.
up or what this guy did here. But it was my recollection is that it was the stores and the older people around there. Just listening to them tell stuff was really neat.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no baseball teams or anything from Newmarket. It was pretty much not a cohesive like village. You didn't identify as a New Marketon or whatever. It was just a good
I see.
uh, country type of, with some stores for entertainment. And we had
Sure. Sure.
all kinds of characters. Now, Woodland Inn, the Netherlands
Yes.
in my time, there was Jack Netherland. See, in those days, you had to sell beer at a different place than whiskey.
About the Woodland Inn, it
Yeah,
still exists in name only as a liquor license. that I think the Sims family owns. If you look
Is
at the
that, yep,
little building to the right of the Cut Rate Liquors, you'll see
yeah.
it says Woodland Inn. And as I
No
understand it,
kidding.
they'll sell a beer a year just to keep their license going. Is that right?
I'll be there. That's neat.
Yeah.
I remember Woodland Building when I was a little tiny kid. It was a
Yeah.
white clapboard type affair. And like I say, it ranged from being a good place to go dance until the Payne brothers, like Big Marion and Joe and all those guys, it used to have the reputation of being a pretty rough place. Adolf Hilp, you remember Adolf, told the story of being in there one night, a big fight broke out, and he left, and there were bottles flying around everywhere. And he got home and noticed he left his hat down there, and so he drove back down to get his hat. And when he got back, there were still bottles flying around, so nobody could get in and stop him. They just had to run down as their own accord.
Who ran the Woodland Inn, and what years would you say it was in operation?
I would say it was in operation from the 20s to just about 1950, early 50s. And I don't know. I know
Okay.
in the latter part, I believe the Netherlands were involved in it in the latter part. I don't know about the earlier times. And I have Adolf Hilp has told me Adolf was a walking reservoir of all kinds of good stuff. But I'd say the 20s to the 50s, early 50s, would catch the Woodland Inn. And like I say,
Okay.
my mother used to go down there and go to dances, and that's what people did for entertainment is go dance.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
they
Right.
would
Right.
big deal. But the right at the beginning of the 1800s, this looked like a totally different place. You know what I'm saying? You could walk through the forest and be clear on the bottom because nobody had cut the trees yet, and it shade out all the the little stuff. So the whole area,
Mm-hmm.
and it had a whole different set of animals. You had mountain lions, you had bobcats, you had bears are back
Wow.
in. So you had a
Sure.
whole different deal. And the rivers and creeks were clear as a crystal, like you say. There's stories about Cartwright Creek being able to see down big fish in the bottom. Now all you can see is mud, and
Wow.
it gets real big or real little. So that's to me the big thing
Right.
is the change.
Richard Crum, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this.
I hope you enjoyed the first episode of the Heritage Hub podcast. For sources mentioned and additional information on the topic of New Market, please visit the Marion County Public Library website.